In the middle of the 8th century, Central Asia became the meeting ground for two expanding worlds that had never directly confronted each other before. One was the Tang Dynasty at the height of its ambition, a state that had grown into the most dazzling civilization of its age. The other was the newly established Abbasid Caliphate, an empire born from revolution, energized by victory, and eager to define its authority across the lands stretching beyond Persia. The competition between them did not begin with an enormous war or a grand ideological clash. Instead, it started with local disputes in valleys and oasis cities that sat along the Silk Road, where merchants traveled, kingdoms schemed for protection, and great powers watched closely for any shift in allegiance. The Tang Dynasty in 751 was at the peak of its glory. Under the long reign of Emperor Xuanzong, the empire had grown into a realm unmatched in wealth, culture, and administrative sophistication. The capital, Chang'an, was a magnificent city, perhaps the largest in the world, filled with traders from distant lands, Buddhist monks from India, diplomats from Persia, and artisans who brought their crafts from Korea and the steppes. Poets found inspiration in everyday life. Scholars filled government offices through the world's most advanced civil service system. While the Tang court cultivated beauty and refinement, it also commanded a formidable military machine. Emperor Xuanzong had reorganized the army so that it no longer depended on short-term conscripts. Instead, the empire relied on professional soldiers who trained constantly, served for years, and followed their commanders with fierce loyalty. These troops, armed with superior equipment such as powerful crossbows and heavy lamellar armor, had pushed Tang influence outward in every direction. Westward expansion became one of the dynasty's greatest ambitions. The Tang government believed that controlling the Central Asian trade routes ensured economic stability and political influence. The Silk Road was more than commerce, it was the path through which tribute states brought their loyalty to the Tang court. These small kingdoms wanted protection from the nomadic powers surrounding them, and many found it safer to align with the Tang than to risk standing alone. By the early 8th century, Tang China had placed military garrisons deep in regions far beyond its heartland, creating a network of influence that reached almost to the borders of Persia. But the Tang were not the only rising force. In 750, the Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown in a violent revolution. The Abbasids, who emerged victorious, moved the political center of the Islamic world eastward. The shift from Damascus to Baghdad signaled more than a change in geography, it reflected a change in power dynamics. The new caliphate drew support from diverse groups, Arabs, Persians, Central Asians, and others who had felt marginalized under Umayyad rule. Their armies were hardened by the revolution, experienced in brutal fighting, and filled with confidence after toppling one of the largest empires on earth. As the Abbasids consolidated control over Persia and reorganized their vast territories, they turned their attention to the frontiers of Transoxiana, the land beyond the Oxus River. This region was a mosaic of small kingdoms and tribal groups whose loyalties shifted often. If the Abbasids could secure these lands, they would create a strong buffer against future threats and gain control over vital trade routes. But Transoxiana was also where Tang influence remained strong. For decades, the Chinese military had stationed troops here, gathering tribute and shaping politics through diplomacy and force. With both powers seeking dominance in the same region, conflict became almost inevitable. The spark that ignited deeper tension came from the Fergana Valley, a fertile region at the crossroads of trade routes. The local kingdoms here had long practiced a delicate dance between the Tang in the east and the various powers to the west. In 750, a dispute broke out between the rulers of Tashkent and Fergana. The king of Fergana, feeling vulnerable, appealed to the Tang dynasty for support. The Tang general in charge of the western regions, Gao Xianji, saw this request as an opportunity to strengthen Chinese control. Gao Xianji was a striking example of the diversity within the Tang military elite. Of Korean descent, he had risen to become one of the empire's most respected field commanders. He was known for boldness, ambition, and hard-won victories. Not long before, he had led troops across the perilous Pamir Mountains, a journey that few armies could have managed. To Gao, asserting dominance over Tashkent was not only a political act but also a demonstration of Tang authority across Central Asia. He marched on Tashkent and promised its ruler safe passage if he surrendered. The king agreed, trusting the general's word. But Gao broke the promise. He looted the city, seized its wealth, and executed the king. His intention was clear: to intimidate surrounding states into submission. But instead of fear, the act produced outrage. The king's son escaped and fled westward in search of help. His journey ended in the court of Abu Muslim, the powerful Abbasid governor of Khorasan and one of the architects of the Abbasid Revolution. The young prince demanded justice for his father's death. For Abu Muslim, the request carried immense strategic value. The Tang general's brutality provided a perfect excuse to intervene in the politics of Central Asia and challenge Chinese power. Abu Muslim immediately sent orders to one of his most capable commanders, Ziyad ibn Salih. He was to gather forces, march east, and confront Gao Xianji directly. In that moment, a local grievance transformed into a confrontation between two civilizations. The Tang moved to defend their influence. The Abbasids moved to assert theirs. Both sides understood that the clash would decide far more than control of a single valley. It would shape the balance of power across the heart of Asia. By the summer of 751, two massive armies were marching toward the Talas River, unaware of how profoundly their encounter would alter the future. The armies that converged near the Talas River in the summer of 751 were shaped by two very different military traditions. Gao Xianji's Tang forces were built around discipline, structure, and advanced weaponry. Ziyad ibn Salih's Abbasid army relied on mobility, adaptability, and the combined strength of diverse peoples who had fought together in the revolution. Although both sides had confidence in their strength, they approached warfare in fundamentally different ways. These differences would determine how the battle unfolded, and ultimately how it ended. Gao Xianji arrived at Talas with an army estimated between 30 and 50,000 soldiers. While these numbers included large groups of local mercenaries and allied tribes, the core of his force consisted of experienced Tang regulars, possibly 10 to 20,000 of them. These were among the finest soldiers in the world at the time. They wore heavy lamellar armor that gave them strong protection against arrows and swords. They trained to fight in tightly organized formations that could hold the line against larger but less disciplined enemies. Their signature weapon was the massed crossbow volley, a devastating tactic capable of breaking enemy charges before they could fully form. The Tang crossbow was not merely a tool of war but a symbol of the empire's technological edge. Its range exceeded that of most bows on the battlefield, and its projectiles could pierce armor effectively. When fired in coordinated volleys, the crossbows produced a storm of bolts that could shred infantry ranks or bring down cavalry from a distance. For decades, Chinese armies had relied on this weapon to dominate their enemies in open-field battles. To protect this powerful but relatively immobile infantry corps, Gao positioned large contingents of cavalry on both flanks. Many of these riders were Karluk Turks, skilled nomads hired for their ability to match and counter the swift horsemen of Central Asia. Their presence was crucial. Without cavalry support, the Tang infantry risked being outmaneuvered by faster armies. With the Karluks in place, Gao believed his force was balanced and capable of responding to any tactic the Abbasids deployed. The Abbasid army under Ziyad ibn Salih was larger and more varied in its composition. It included Arab and Persian soldiers who had gained invaluable experience during the brutal civil war that brought the Abbasids to power. In addition to these core forces, the army was joined by local Turkic groups and Tibetan allies. While their armor and equipment lacked the standardization of the Tang forces, their combined experience created a formidable coalition. They were used to adapting quickly in the chaos of battle. What they lacked in technology, they made up for in grit, mobility, and the ability to coordinate under pressure. The true strength of Ziyad's army lay in its cavalry. Unlike the Tang, who relied heavily on infantry formations, the Abbasids excelled in mounted warfare. Their horsemen could strike quickly, retreat to avoid volleys of crossbow bolts, and circle around to threaten the flanks or rear of enemy lines. Heavy cavalry units, armed with lances and coated in armor, delivered powerful charges capable of breaking formations if timed correctly. Ziyad understood that he could not win a prolonged ranged engagement against the Tang. His best hope was to force movement, create openings, and unleash his cavalry at the perfect moment. Both armies arrived at Talas knowing that the region's fate depended on their decisions. The plains along the river offered open ground where cavalry could maneuver and infantry could anchor the fight. Ziyad arranged his troops in a formation similar to Gao's, with infantry in the center and cavalry on the wings. Gao formed his crossbowmen and heavy infantry into a solid line at the front, with the Karluks guarding both sides. Each commander waited for the other to make the first move. Both understood that the battle would not be won with a single charge but through a contest of endurance, discipline, and timing. When the opening volleys finally started, the field of Talas became a proving ground for two world powers whose ambitions had traveled thousands of miles to meet across a single river. The battle at Talas began with a thunderous exchange of arrows and bolts that immediately revealed the Tang technological advantage. Tang crossbowmen stepped forward, raised their weapons in tightly coordinated lines, and released volleys that cut deeply into the front ranks of the Abbasid army. The bolts whistled through the air and struck with crushing impact, forcing Ziyad's archers to fall back before they could return fire effectively. Clouds of dust rose as ranks shifted, and the Abbasid infantry had no choice but to brace themselves under the storm. Once Gao Xianji saw that the Abbasid missile units had been suppressed, he ordered his infantry to advance. The Tang line moved like a single living wall, shields locked, spears angled forward, armor glinting under the sun. When they collided with the Abbasid center, the sound was like metal striking stone. The Tang formations were dense and disciplined, pushing forward step by step. The Abbasid infantry, though courageous and determined, found themselves giving ground as the pressure increased. Each foot surrendered meant the Tang were closer to securing dominance in the center. Ziyad knew he could not allow the front to crumble. He signaled to his cavalry. Waves of horsemen rode forward in sweeping arcs on both sides of the battlefield. Their goal was to break around the Tang infantry and attack the flanks or rear. But Gao had anticipated this. The Karluk Turks he had positioned on the wings surged into motion. Their riders clashed with the Abbasid cavalry again and again, preventing them from reaching vulnerable positions. The two sides fought with maneuver, speed, and violent precision, but neither could gain decisive ground. This pattern repeated for several days. Each morning, the Tang crossbows opened the fight with devastating volleys. Their infantry advanced steadily, grinding forward through determination and superior equipment. The Abbasid line bent but held under the strain. Meanwhile, Ziyad continued sending his cavalry to find a weakness, but each attempt met resistance from the Karluks. The battlefield filled with the bodies of the fallen, and yet neither army could claim victory. Despite their smaller numbers, the Tang seemed to hold the advantage. Their discipline never wavered, and their formations remained cohesive. They inflicted constant pressure on the Abbasids, forcing Ziyad's troops to fight desperately just to avoid collapsing. The Abbasid cavalry suffered heavy losses from repeated failed flanking attempts. Exhaustion crept into the faces of the soldiers. Weapons grew heavier. Armor rubbed painfully against sweat-soaked skin. By the fourth or fifth day, the tension reached a breaking point. Ziyad's forces were exhausted, bleeding, and struggling to maintain cohesion. The Tang infantry was battered as well, but their confidence grew as they continued to push the Abbasids back. Gao Xianji, seeing the enemy line weakening, likely prepared his troops for a final decisive assault. Victory felt close, almost within reach. Everything seemed to favor the Tang army. But war does not always reward preparation or discipline. Sometimes it turns on a decision or a betrayal that no commander can prevent. As the battle stretched on and exhaustion pulled at both armies, a group that had appeared loyal, the Karluk Turks, began to reconsider their position. Whether motivated by promises from Ziyad, ethnic ties with Turkic fighters in the Abbasid ranks, or a calculation that the Chinese side might ultimately lose, the Karluks made a decision that would alter the fate of the entire battle. What happened next would transform the grinding stalemate into one of the most sudden and catastrophic reversals in early medieval history. On the day when Gao Xianji believed victory was near, the battlefield erupted into chaos. Without warning, the Karluk Turks, who had served on the Tang flanks since the battle began, turned their horses away from the Abbasid cavalry and charged straight into the side and rear of the Tang formation. The betrayal was swift, violent, and perfectly timed. 4 days, the Karluks had blocked Abbasid cavalry charges. Now they unleashed their own power on the army they were supposed to defend. Historians have long debated the reasons for the Karluk defection. Some believe Ziyad ibn Salih had been negotiating with them in secret, offering land, wealth, and a more favorable political future under Abbasid influence. Others point to Turkic cultural ties. Perhaps Karluk leaders felt more connected to the Turkic soldiers fighting for the Abbasids than to the distant Chinese empire that hired them. Another possibility is that the Karluks simply recognized the shifting momentum of the battle. The Tang were exhausted. The Abbasids, though struggling, still had reserves. The Karluks may have decided that backing the side likely to win was the safest option for their own survival. Regardless of the reasoning, the effect was immediate. The Tang infantry, trained to fight enemies in front of them, suddenly found themselves hit from behind. Their tight formations, once their greatest strength, became a liability. Soldiers were squeezed together, unable to turn or adjust quickly enough to face attackers from three sides. Panic began to spread as men realized the allies they trusted had now become enemies. Gao Xianji, positioned toward the rear of the army, saw the sudden collapse with horror. Ziyad ibn Salih reacted instantly. Recognizing the opportunity created by the betrayal, he ordered a full assault. The Abbasid infantry, who had been close to breaking only hours before, surged forward with renewed determination. Their cavalry charged as well, this time with clear openings to strike the vulnerable Tang formations. Heavy riders thundered across the plain, smashing into disoriented infantry whose shields no longer formed an impenetrable wall. The battlefield transformed into a trap. The Tang were surrounded on nearly all sides. Arrows and spears struck from behind, while swords and lances pressed from the front. Soldiers who had fought with discipline for days now struggled simply to survive. Units that had once advanced in perfect coordination were dragged apart by fear and confusion. The clang of armor, the cries of wounded men, and the thundering of hooves blended into a terrible storm. Some Tang soldiers tried to break out of the encirclement, but their heavy armor slowed them. The Karluks, now fighting fiercely for the Abbasid side, cut down fleeing soldiers. Those who attempted to remove their armor to run faster lost precious time and were overtaken. The Abbasid cavalry pursued relentlessly. Gao Xianji gathered his remaining personal guards and attempted to carve a path to safety. He fought with determination, knowing the battle was lost but believing that survival might preserve some chance for future recovery. With a few thousand men, he managed to escape toward the mountains. But the rest of his army was shattered. Most estimates suggest that only a small fraction, perhaps a few thousand, survived. Tens of thousands were killed or captured in the aftermath. The defeat was total and devastating. One of the most disciplined armies in the world had been undone not by superior tactics, but by betrayal at the worst possible moment. The Battle of Talas ended not with a gradual victory, but with a sudden collapse that reshaped the political map of Central Asia. The aftermath of the Battle of Talas sent shockwaves across Asia. For the Abbasid Caliphate, the victory marked a decisive shift in regional power. The small Central Asian kingdoms that had previously balanced between Tang China and Islamic Persia now saw clearly which side held the upper hand. Many moved swiftly to align with the Abbasids, offering allegiance and tribute. In the decades that followed, Islam spread steadily across the region, transforming Central Asia into one of the major centers of Islamic civilization. Trade routes remained open, but control of the Silk Road passed from Chinese hands to Muslim ones, strengthening the Abbasid economy and influence. For the Tang Dynasty, the defeat was a humiliation. Their western expansion, which had lasted for generations, came to an abrupt halt. Gao Xianji survived, but his reputation was shattered. More importantly, the Tang frontier armies suffered staggering losses that could not be easily replaced. The empire still possessed great wealth and culture, but its grip on distant regions loosened. Worse, the internal structure of the Tang state soon faced a crisis far more devastating than any foreign defeat. Only 4 years after Talas, in 755, the Lushan rebellion erupted. A powerful general with mixed Sogdian Turkic heritage attempted to seize control of the empire. The rebellion plunged China into one of the deadliest civil wars in world history. Millions died. Cities were destroyed. The Tang government, desperate to survive, recalled every available frontier garrison, including those in Central Asia. Once those troops withdrew, Chinese influence in the region evaporated. The Tang would never again project military power so far west. Yet the most unexpected impact of the Battle of Talas had nothing to do with armies or territory. Among the thousands of Tang soldiers captured after the defeat were craftsmen who knew a closely guarded secret: how to make paper. For nearly 1,000 years, China had protected the knowledge of papermaking. Paper was cheaper and easier to produce than parchment. It allowed China to develop a literate bureaucracy, a vast body of scholarship, and efficient systems of communication. When these prisoners were brought to Samarkand and later to Baghdad, they revealed the techniques of papermaking to their captors. The Abbasids quickly recognized the value of this technology. They built paper mills using the knowledge extracted from the Chinese craftsmen, adapting and improving the process. Soon, Baghdad became a global center of paper production. This advancement helped fuel what later became known as the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars in the Islamic world embraced paper for copying works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. Libraries grew rapidly. Knowledge spread faster than ever before. Observatories were built. Hospitals advanced. Scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, preserving and expanding the world's intellectual heritage. None of this would have developed as quickly without access to inexpensive paper. Through the Islamic world, papermaking knowledge flowed into Europe, particularly through Muslim Spain. Over time, parchment was slowly replaced by paper. European literacy expanded. Scholars, monks, merchants, and scientists began to fill shelves with manuscripts that would have been too costly to produce before. This shift paved the way for the next major revolution in information, the printing press. When Johannes Gutenberg developed movable type in the 15th century, it was the widespread availability of paper that allowed printed books to spread rapidly. Without paper, the Renaissance and the scientific revolution might have unfolded far differently. Thus, the Battle of Talas stands as one of history's strange turning points. A clash between two expanding empires produced immediate political consequences, but its most enduring legacy came from something entirely unexpected: the transfer of knowledge carried by anonymous prisoners of war. Through their skills, the world gained a technology that would eventually reshape civilizations across continents. The battle that ended a Chinese expansion also helped unlock an age of learning, discovery, and innovation whose echoes continue to shape the modern world.